Captain James Morrison stood at attention outside Buckingham Palace. His red uniform pressed to perfection, his black bearskin hat casting shadows over his weathered face. For 15 years, he had served the crown with unwavering dedication, earning respect from his peers and recognition from his superiors. But today, something felt different. Today, the weight of his responsibilities felt heavier than usual. Inside his breast pocket, a crumpled letter from his wife Sarah lay close to his heart. She had written it 3 days ago, her elegant handwriting betraying the tremor of emotion behind each word. "James," it began, "I know your duty means everything to you, but I need you to know that I'm struggling. Our marriage feels like a shadow of what it once was. I feel like I'm married to a ghost who visits our home between shifts." James had read those words countless times, each reading cutting deeper into his soul. He remembered the woman he had married 20 years ago, Sarah's bright smile, her infectious laugh, the way her eyes sparkled when she talked about their future together. They had been young then, full of dreams and promises. He had just joined the Royal Guard, proud to serve his country, and she had supported him completely. The early years of their marriage had been beautiful. Sarah would wait for him after his shifts, warm dinner ready, eager to hear about his day. She understood the importance of his work and never complained about the long hours or the demanding schedule. They had planned to have children, to build a life together that balanced his service to the crown with their love for each other. But somewhere along the way, things had changed. The promotions came with more responsibilities, longer hours, and greater expectations. James found himself staying late for meetings, volunteering for extra shifts, and bringing work home in his mind, if not on paper. The Royal Guard wasn't just his job, it had become his identity, his purpose, his everything. Sarah had tried to adapt. She had learned to eat dinner alone most nights, to attend social gatherings by herself, to make excuses for her absent husband. She had become an expert at smiling and saying, "Oh, you know, James, always dedicated to his duty," when friends asked where he was. But behind that smile, her heart was breaking a little more each day. The turning point had come 6 months ago. During their wedding anniversary, James had promised to take her to their favorite restaurant, the same place where he had proposed years earlier. Sarah had bought a new dress, made reservations, and spent the afternoon preparing for what she hoped would be a romantic evening together. But at the last minute, an emergency at the palace had called him away. "I'm sorry, darling," he had said, already reaching for his uniform jacket. "There's a security concern that needs my immediate attention. We'll reschedule, I promise." Had stood in their bedroom doorway, watching him dress in his formal attire, her new dress still hanging unworn in the closet. She didn't say anything that night, but James could see the disappointment in her eyes, the way her shoulders sagged with resignation. That was the night Sarah realized she had lost her husband to his duty, not to another woman, not to a terrible accident, but to something that seemed even more insurmountable: his absolute commitment to serving the crown. She began to understand that she was competing with an institution that had existed for centuries, with traditions and expectations that demanded everything from those who served. Now, standing at his post, James felt the full weight of his choices. His fellow guards respected him, his superiors trusted him, and the royal family depended on him. He had built his entire identity around being the perfect soldier, the reliable protector, the man who never let duty slide for personal concerns. But in building that reputation, he had slowly dismantled his marriage. The irony wasn't lost on him. He protected others every day, ensured their safety and well-being. But he had failed to protect the most important thing in his own life: his relationship with the woman he loved. Sarah had been patient, understanding, and supportive for so long. But even the strongest foundations could crack under constant pressure as tourists walked by. Taking pictures of the stoic guards, James wondered what they would think if they knew the internal battle raging behind his composed exterior. Would they still see him as a symbol of unwavering dedication? Or would they recognize him as a man torn between two different kinds of love: love for his country and love for his wife? The afternoon sun beat down on his uniform, but James remained perfectly still, his training taking over even as his heart ached. He'd always believed that duty and love could coexist, The good man could serve both his country and his family with equal dedication. But Sarah's letter had forced him to confront a painful truth sometimes. Life demands choices that have no perfect solutions. In just a few hours, his shift would end, and he would return home to face the woman whose heart he had broken through. Neglect, rather than intention. The question that tormented him was simple yet impossible to answer. Could a man who had given everything to duty find a way back to love? The key turned in the lock with its familiar click, but tonight the sound seemed louder than usual in the quiet hallway of their modest London home. James Morrison stepped inside, his heavy boots echoing on the wooden floor as he hung his ceremonial sword by the door. The house felt different somehow, not unfriendly, but distant, like a place he was visiting rather than the home he had shared with Sarah for 2 decades. Sarah was in the kitchen, her back turned to him as she washed dishes. From her solitary dinner, she wore the blue sweater he had bought her for Christmas 3 years ago, and her dark hair was pulled back in the simple ponytail she preferred when she was working around the house. For a moment, James just watched her, remembering how she used to rush to greet him when he came home, how her face would light up when she heard his key in the door. "You're later than usual tonight," she said without turning around, her voice carefully neutral. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. But James heard the years of disappointment hidden beneath those simple words. "There was a ceremony preparation meeting," he replied, setting his hat on the hallway table. "The Queen's birthday parade next month requires additional security measures." Sarah nodded, continuing to scrub a plate that was already clean. "Saved you some dinner. It's in the refrigerator." The politeness between them felt like a wall built from years of unspoken resentment and growing distance. James remembered when they used to talk for hours about everything and nothing, when silence between them was comfortable rather than charged with tension. Now they moved around each other like careful strangers, both afraid to say too much or too little. James heated his dinner in the microwave, the mechanical hum filling the kitchen, while Sarah finished the dishes. They had perfected this dance of avoidance, each knowing exactly how to occupy the same space without really connecting. He ate mechanically, tasting nothing while she wiped down counters that didn't need cleaning. "Sarah," he began, then stopped. What could he say that he was sorry, that he would change? He had made those promises before, and life had always found a way to pull him back into his duties. "How was your day?" She turned to face him for the first time since he had arrived home. Her brown eyes, once so warm and inviting, looked tired. "Mrs. Henderson asked about you again today. She wanted to invite us both to their anniversary party next weekend." Sarah paused, folding the dish towel with precise movements. "I told her I would have to check with you, but we both know you'll probably have to work." James winced. The Hendersons were their neighbors and had become good friends over the years, or rather, Sarah's friends. James had missed so many social gatherings that people had stopped expecting him to show up. Sarah had become skilled at making excuses for his absence, at representing their marriage solo at community events. "I could try to arrange the weekend off," he offered, though they both knew how hollow that promise sounded. He had said similar things countless times before, only to have duty call him away at the last minute. Sarah sat down across from him at their small kitchen table, the same table where they had shared breakfast on their first morning as newlyweds, where they had discussed their dreams and plans for the future. Now it felt like a negotiating table between two people trying to salvage something that might already be lost. "James," she said quietly, "do you remember what you said to me on our wedding day?" He set down his fork, his appetite completely gone now. Of course he remembered. He had promised to love and cherish her, to put their marriage first, to build a life together that would be their sanctuary from the world. "I said I would love you and protect you for the rest of my life," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "You did promise to protect me," Sarah agreed. "But James, you can't protect someone you're never around to see. You can't love someone who feels invisible in their own marriage." The words hung between them like a bridge neither seemed brave enough to cross. James looked at his wife, really looked at her, and saw the loneliness that had been growing in her eyes for years. He saw the woman who had supported his dreams, who had sacrificed her own needs for his career, who had slowly learned to live without him while still being married to him. "I never meant for it to happen this way," he said, reaching across the table toward her hand, but stopping short when she didn't move to meet him halfway. When I took the oath to serve the crown, I thought I could balance everything. I thought I could be a good husband and a good soldier. Sarah's smile was sad but not bitter. I know you didn't mean for it to happen. That's what makes it so hard. If you had chosen duty over me deliberately, I could be angry, but you genuinely believed you could have both, and somehow that makes it worse. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of 20 years pressing down on them. Outside, London continued its evening rhythm. Cars passing. People walking home from work. Normal couples probably having normal conversations about normal days. James envied them their simplicity, their problems that could be solved with ordinary solutions. What do we do now? He asked, afraid of her answer but needing to know. Sarah stood up, gathering his empty plate even though he had barely touched the food. I don't know, James. I really don't know. I love you. I've never stopped loving you. But I'm tired of being married to a memory, tired of competing with duty for scraps of your attention. As she moved around the kitchen, cleaning up the remnants of another solitary evening, James realized that this conversation was different from their previous discussions about his work schedule. This wasn't about missed dinners or forgotten anniversaries anymore. This was about the fundamental question of whether their marriage could survive his unwavering commitment to duty. The most painful part was that he couldn't promise to change, not completely. His duty to the crown wasn't just a job he could modify or leave behind. It was woven into his very identity, as much a part of him as his heartbeat. But looking at Sarah, seeing the resignation in her movements, he understood that without change, he might lose the only woman he had ever truly loved. Tonight, for the first time in years, James Morrison would go to bed knowing that his greatest battle wasn't against external threats to the crown, but against the consequences of his own choices. The emergency call came at 3 a.m, piercing through the darkness of their bedroom like a blade. James jolted awake, his military training immediately bringing him to full alertness, even as Sarah stirred beside him, her face creased, with the familiar mixture of concern and resignation that had become her default expression whenever his phone rang at unusual hours. "Captain Morrison," he answered, already swinging his legs out of bed and reaching for the uniform he kept ready. On the chair beside their bed, old habits from years of sudden deployments and emergency situations. "Captain, we need you at the palace immediately," came the voice of Lieutenant Hayes, his second in command. "There's been a security breach in the grounds. Nothing serious, but protocol requires your presence for the investigation." James was already buttoning his shirt, his movements automatic and efficient. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said, ending the call and reaching for his jacket. Sarah sat up in bed, her hair tousled from sleep, watching him dress with eyes that held no surprise, only a deep wariness that seemed to have settled into her bones. This scene had played out hundreds of times over their marriage. The urgent call, the immediate response, the rapid departure that left her alone in their bed wondering when or if he would return. "How long this time?" she asked quietly, not bothering to hide the exhaustion in her voice. "I don't know, James," replied honestly, checking his watch. "Could be a few hours, could be longer, depends on what they find." Sarah nodded, pulling her robe around her shoulders as she got up to see him off. Another ritual in their well-established routine of interrupted nights and solitary mornings. They moved through their house like actors who had performed this scene too many times to need a script, each knowing their part by heart. At the front door, James paused, looking back at his wife who stood in the hallway, looking smaller somehow. In her pale blue nightgown and robe, her face was resigned but not angry, which somehow made the moment even more painful. If she had been furious, if she had shouted at him or demanded he stay, he might have felt justified in his choice. But her quiet acceptance of his departure felt like a judgment more severe than any angry words could have been. "Sarah," he began, wanting to say something that would bridge the growing gap between them, but she shook her head gently. "Just go, James. They're waiting for you." He kissed her forehead, a brief informal gesture that felt more like a goodbye than a temporary farewell, and stepped into the cold London morning. As he drove through the empty streets toward Buckingham Palace, James couldn't shake the image of Sarah standing in their doorway, looking like a woman who had finally stopped hoping for something different. The security situation at the palace turned out to be minor. A confused tourist who had somehow managed to scale a section of the outer fence and was found wandering the grounds, clearly intoxicated and completely harmless. The investigation was thorough but routine, the kind of incident that required careful documentation, but posed no real threat to anyone. Under normal circumstances, James would have delegated the paperwork to a junior officer and returned home within a few hours. But these weren't normal circumstances. As he sat in his office, filling out reports and reviewing security protocols, James found himself deliberately slowing down, finding reasons to extend his stay at the palace. Part of him knew he was avoiding the inevitable conversation waiting for him at home, postponing the moment when he would have to face Sarah and the growing crisis in their marriage. By the time he finally made it home, the sun was setting, painting their street in shades of gold and amber that reminded him of happier times when he and Sarah would take evening walks together, talking about their day and making plans for the future. Those simple pleasures seemed like memories from another lifetime now, casualties of his increasing dedication to duty. Sarah was in the garden, tending to the roses she had planted during their 5th year of marriage. She had always found peace in gardening, and over the years it had become her refuge, the place where she went when the loneliness became too much to bear. James watched her through the kitchen window, noting how gracefully she moved among the flowers, how naturally she seemed to belong in this quiet space they had created together. When he stepped outside to join her, Sarah didn't look up from the rose bush she was pruning. Her movements were careful and deliberate, each cut precise and purposeful. "The Hendersons' party was this afternoon," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the small garden with crystal clarity. James felt his heart sink. He had completely forgotten about the anniversary celebration. The event Sarah had mentioned just the night before, the social gathering she had hoped they might attend together for once. "Sarah, I'm sorry. The investigation ran longer than expected." And then there were reports to file. There are always reports to file. She interrupted gently, finally looking up to meet his eyes. "There's always something, James. There's always a reason why duty comes first." She set down her pruning shears and brushed the dirt from her hands. A simple gesture that somehow felt final. "Went alone again. And for 3 hours, I made excuses. For you again, I smiled and told everyone how important your work is, how proud I am of your service to the crown." James wanted to defend himself, to explain how the security breach had required his personal attention, how the protocols demanded his presence, but the words died in his throat. Because he knew, and Sarah knew, that this wasn't really about today's emergency or yesterday's meeting or any single incident. This was about a pattern that had been building for years, a slow erosion of their connection that no amount of explanations could repair. "Mrs. Henderson asked me something today," Sarah continued, picking up a wilted rose from the ground and turning it over in her hands. "She asked me if I ever felt like a widow to a living man." The question hit James like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the reality of what his choices had done to the woman he loved. Sarah wasn't being dramatic or cruel. She was simply stating a truth that had become impossible to ignore. That night they ate dinner in silence, 2 people sitting at the same table, but occupying entirely different worlds. James realized that somewhere in his pursuit of being the perfect soldier, he had forgotten how to be a husband. And now, looking at Sarah across their kitchen table, he wondered if it might already be too late to remember. Sarah's suitcase lay open on their bed like a wound, half filled with carefully folded clothes and personal items that represented 20 years of shared life. James stood in the doorway of their bedroom, watching his wife methodically pack her belongings with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything she did. Each item she placed in the suitcase felt like another piece of their marriage being dismantled before his eyes. "Oh, where will you go?" he asked, his voice hoarse from the argument that had raged between them for the past 2 hours. A shouting match. They were both too emotionally exhausted for anger anymore, but rather a painful dissection of everything that had gone wrong between them. "My sister's house in Brighton," Sarah replied without looking up from the sweater she was folding, "at least for now. I need space to think, James. I need time away from this house, away from waiting for phone calls that pull you away from our life. James stepped into the room, desperate to close the distance between them, but not knowing how. Sarah, please, can work this out. I can request a transfer to a less demanding position. I can what? She interrupted, finally meeting his eyes. Can you promise me you'll never choose duty over our marriage again? Can you guarantee that the next time your phone rings in the middle of the night, you'll stay home with me instead of running to the palace? The silence that followed her questions was answer enough. They both knew he couldn't make those promises, not honestly. His commitment to the crown wasn't something he could simply turn on and off like a switch. It was woven into his very identity, as fundamental to who he was as his name or his heartbeat. Sarah sat down on the edge of the bed, her hands resting in her lap as she looked around the room they had shared for so many years. Do you remember? When we first moved into this house, she asked, her voice soft with memory. You carried me over the threshold even though we'd already been married for 3 years. You said this would be our sanctuary, our place in the world where nothing else could touch us, James remembered. He remembered the laughter, the plans they had made, the dreams they had shared about the life they would build together. He remembered, promising her that no matter how demanding his career became, their home would always be their priority. Their marriage would always come first. I kept that promise for a while, he said quietly. In the beginning, I really did try to balance everything. I know you did, Sarah agreed, and I tried to. I tried to understand the pressure you were under, the importance of your work. Told myself that your dedication to duty was one of the things I loved about you. But somewhere along the way, your dedication became obsession, and I became the casualty of your noble intentions. She stood up and moved to their dresser, gathering the few remaining personal items she wanted to take with her. A photograph of their wedding day, a jewelry box he had given her for their 10th anniversary, a small ceramic bird she had bought. During their honeymoon in Scotland, each item told the story of their relationship, marking moments when they had been happy, when the future had seemed bright with possibility. I've been thinking about this for months, Sarah continued, wrapping the ceramic bird carefully in tissue paper. Every time you chose duty over our marriage, every time you missed a dinner or canceled plans, or came home exhausted and distant, I told myself it was temporary. I convinced myself that eventually things would get better, that you would remember what we meant to each other. James watched her pack their memories away, feeling helpless in a way he had never experienced during his military career. He had faced dangerous situations, made split-second decisions under pressure, led men through difficult missions. But nothing in his training had prepared him for this kind of battle, the fight to save a marriage that was slowly dying from neglect. The night you missed our anniversary dinner was when I finally understood, Sarah said, pausing in her packing to look directly at him. I sat at that restaurant for an hour, watching other couples celebrate their love, and I realized I wasn't angry anymore. It was just ... empty. That scared me more than anger ever could. James felt tears threatening for the first time in years. What can I do, Sarah? Tell me what you need me to do and I'll do it. That's just it, James. You still don't understand. This isn't about doing something different for a few weeks or months until the crisis passes. This is about, fundamentally, choosing what matters most to you, and we both know what that choice has been for years. She zipped the suitcase closed with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire house. I'm not asking you to abandon your duty to the crown. I would never ask you to give up something that's so important to you. But I can't keep sacrificing my entire life, my happiness, my sense of self-worth, waiting for scraps of attention from a man who has already given his heart to something else. The finality in her voice made James realize that this wasn't just a temporary separation born from a moment of frustration. This was a decision Sarah had been building toward for months, maybe years. She had tried to save their marriage alone, while he had been focused elsewhere, and now she was exhausted from the effort. Is there anything I can say that would make you stay? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Sarah picked up her suitcase and faced him one last time. If you had asked me that question 2 years ago, or even 1 year ago, the answer might have been different. James, I'm 43 years old. I've spent the last decade of my life feeling like a guest in my own marriage. I need to find out who I am when I'm not constantly making excuses for someone else's choices. She walked past him toward the bedroom door, then stopped and turned back. I love you, James. I will probably always love the man I married, the man who promised to build a life with me. But I can't love a memory forever while the real man chooses duty over everything else, including his own happiness. Sarah carried her suitcase down the stairs and out of their home. James remained standing in their empty bedroom, surrounded by the silence of a house that had been slowly dying for years. For the first time in his adult life, Captain James Morrison, as a decorated officer of the Royal Guard, didn't know what his next move should be. The sound of Sarah's car driving away marked the end of one chapter of his life and the terrifying beginning of another, one where he would have to decide whether a man could live on duty alone, or whether some battles were worth losing everything else to win. The house felt like a tomb. James had been living alone for 3 weeks now, and the silence had become his constant companion, more oppressive than any enemy he had ever faced in his military career. Every morning he woke up reaching for Sarah's warmth beside him, only to find cold, empty sheets. Every evening he came home expecting to smell dinner cooking or hear her voice calling a greeting from another room. But instead, he was met with the hollow echo of his own footsteps. He had thrown himself even deeper into his work, volunteering for extra shifts, staying late for unnecessary meetings. Anything to avoid returning to the empty house that reminded him of everything he had lost. His fellow guards had noticed his increased dedication with approval, praising his commitment and suggesting him for additional honors. If only they knew that his perfect attendance was really just elaborate avoidance of his personal failures. It was Lieutenant Hayes, who finally forced him to confront reality. James was reviewing security reports for the 3rd time that afternoon, finding small errors to correct that didn't really matter, when his second-in-command knocked on his office door. Captain, sir? Might I have a word? James looked up from the paperwork, noting the concerned expression on the young officer's face. Hayes was a good soldier, dedicated and observant, the kind of man James had been proud to mentor over the years. Of course, Lieutenant, what's on your mind? Hayes closed the door behind him and sat down across from James's desk, an unusual formality that immediately put James on alert. In their normal working relationship, such meetings were casual, focused on operational matters and personnel issues. Sir, I hope you'll forgive my boldness, but I'm worried about you. You've been working 18-hour days. You look like you haven't slept properly in weeks. And frankly, sir, you seem ... lost. James set down his pen, surprised by his subordinate's directness. I appreciate your concern, Lieutenant, but I assure you I'm perfectly capable of managing my duties. It's just it, sir. You're not just managing your duties anymore. You're hiding in them. Hayes leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. My wife mentioned that she hasn't seen Mrs. Morrison around the neighborhood lately. Is everything all right at home? The simple question broke through James's carefully constructed defenses. For 3 weeks he had maintained his professional composure, presenting the same steady, reliable facade he had perfected over 15 years of service. But sitting across from this young officer who reminded him of his younger self, James finally felt the weight of his isolation. She left, he said quietly, the words feeling strange and bitter in his mouth. Sarah left me 3 weeks ago. His expression softened with genuine sympathy. I'm sorry to hear that, sir. That must be incredibly difficult. The worst part, James continued, surprising himself with his openness, is that I can't even be angry with her. She was right about everything. I chose duty over our marriage so many times that eventually there was no marriage left to choose. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of James's admission hanging between them. Finally, Hayes spoke again, his voice careful and respectful. Sir, if you don't mind me asking, what are you going to do about it? James looked out his office window at the palace grounds, at the tourists taking photographs of the guards, at the orderly world of protocol and tradition that had been his anchor for so many years. I don't know. For the first time in my adult life, I honestly don't know what I'm supposed to do. Maybe Hayes suggested gently, the question isn't what you're supposed to do, but what you want to do. That afternoon, James found himself walking through London's streets without any particular destination, something he hadn't done in years. He passed couples holding hands, families enjoying the sunshine. People who seemed to move through the world with an ease and contentment that felt foreign to him now. He ended up at a small cafe where he and Sarah used to meet sometimes in there. Early marriage, back when his schedule was more flexible, and they still made time for spontaneous moments together. The owner recognized him and asked about Sarah with the casual friendliness of someone who remembered better times. "She's visiting her sister," James replied, the lie coming easily, but leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. Sitting alone at their old table, nursing a cup of tea he didn't really want, James forced himself to confront the question Hayes had posed. What did he want to do? For so long, his wants and his duties had been perfectly aligned. He had wanted to serve the crown, wanted to excel in his career, wanted to be the kind of man others could depend on. But now, sitting in this cafe filled with the ghosts of his happier memories, he realized that somewhere along the way he had stopped asking himself what he actually wanted from life. He pulled out his phone and stared at Sarah's contact information, his finger hovering over her number. He had called her twice in the past 3 weeks. Awkward conversations where they had discussed practical matters like mail forwarding and bill payments, carefully avoiding any mention of their relationship or their future. Both conversations had ended with polite goodbyes that felt like small deaths. But now in this place, where they had once been happy, James finally understood what Hayes had been trying to tell him. The question wasn't whether he could balance duty and love clearly. He had failed at that for years. The question was whether he was brave enough to fight for what really mattered, even if it meant changing everything about the life he had built. James Morrison had spent 15 years learning how to be the perfect soldier, but he had never learned how to be a man who could admit when he was wrong, ask for forgiveness, and fight for love with the same dedication he had always reserved for duty. That evening, for the first time in 3 weeks, James left the palace at the end of his regular shift instead of finding excuses to stay late. He drove home through the London streets. But instead of dreading the empty house that awaited him, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the possibility that it wasn't too late to choose a different path. The first step would be the hardest, admitting that the life he had built, the identity he had crafted, the priorities he had maintained were not making him happy. The second step would be even harder, finding the courage to change everything in pursuit of something he had lost but might still be able to reclaim. The train to Brighton felt like the longest journey James had ever taken, though it was only an hour from London. He had made this trip spontaneously, without calling ahead, without planning what he would say, driven by a desperation that had finally overcome his pride. In his hand, he clutched a letter of resignation that he had written and rewritten a dozen times the night before. Sarah's sister Emma lived in a small cottage near the sea, the kind of place Sarah had always dreamed of retiring to someday. As James walked up the garden path, he could see Sarah through the kitchen window, helping Emma prepare lunch. She looked different somehow, lighter, more relaxed than he had seen her in years. The sight filled him with both hope and regret. Emma answered the door, her expression a mixture of surprise and caution. "James, Sarah didn't mention you were coming. She doesn't know I'm here," he admitted. "I was hoping we could talk." Emma studied his face for a moment, then stepped aside to let him in. "She's in the kitchen, but James, please don't hurt her again. She's finally starting to heal." Sarah looked up when he entered the kitchen, her face going through a series of emotions: surprise, concern, wariness, and something else he couldn't quite identify. She was wearing a simple yellow sundress he had never seen before. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, the way she had worn it when they first met. "James, what are you doing here?" "I came to tell you that you were right," he said, the words tumbling out before he could lose his nerve. "About everything. About duty, about our marriage, about the choice I've been making every day for years, without even realizing it." Sarah set down the dish towel she had been holding, her expression guarded. "I appreciate you saying that, but I resigned my commission," James interrupted, pulling the letter from his jacket pocket. "Yesterday morning, after 15 years of service, I walked into my commander's office and told him I was done." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah stared at him as if he had announced he was giving up breathing. Emma quietly excused herself from the kitchen, sensing that this was a conversation that needed privacy. You resigned? Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. James, your career, everything you've worked for. Everything I worked for cost me everything that actually mattered, James replied, moving closer but still maintaining respectful distance. I spent so many years thinking I was being noble, thinking I was serving something greater than myself. But what's noble about destroying your marriage? What's honorable about choosing duty over the person you love most in the world? Sarah sat down heavily in one of Emma's kitchen chairs, as if the news had knocked the strength out of her legs. I never asked you to give up your career. That wasn't what I wanted. I know, James said, sitting across from her at the small table. You ask me to choose you sometimes. You ask me to remember that we were supposed to be building a life together. You ask me to come home to you, not just to the house we shared. He reached across the table, stopping just short of touching her hand. Sarah, I've been thinking about what you said the night you left, about feeling like a widow to a living man. I realized that's exactly what I had become, a man who was so busy living up to an ideal that he forgot how to actually live. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't pull away when he finally took her hand in his. James, I'm scared. I'm scared that even if you mean this now, even if you think you can change, something will happen and you'll regret giving up everything. For me, the only thing I regret, James said, his voice thick with emotion, is that it took me losing you to understand what I was throwing away. Do you know what I realized during these past 3 weeks alone in our house? I realized that without you, all my duty and honor and service felt meaningless. I was protecting and serving everyone except the person who mattered most. Sarah wiped her eyes with her free hand, but she didn't let go of his. What will you do now? The royal guard has been your whole life? James smiled, and for the first time in months, it reached his eyes. I've been offered a position training security personnel for a private firm. It's normal hours, weekends free, no emergency calls at 3 in the morning. It's not glamorous, and it doesn't come with ceremonies and honors, but it comes with something. More valuable time to be a husband instead of just a soldier. You really resigned, Sarah said, as if she still couldn't quite believe it. After 15 years, you just walked away. I walked towards something more important, James corrected. I walked toward the possibility of saving us, if you'll let me. If it's not too late. Sarah was quiet for a long time, looking out the window at Emma's garden, where roses climbed up a trellis toward the afternoon sun. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but clear. I don't know if we can go back to what we were, she said. Too much has happened, too much time has passed, but maybe we can figure out who we are now. Maybe we can build something new instead of trying to repair something that was broken for so long. James felt hope flood through him like sunlight breaking through clouds. I'd like that. I'd like to learn how to be the husband you deserved. All along, it won't be easy, Sarah warned. I've gotten used to being independent, to making decisions without considering anyone else. And you've spent so many years defined by your duty that I'm not sure either of us knows who you are without it. Then we'll figure it out together, James said. It's the way we should have been doing all along. Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the sea in the distance. James watched her, noting how the afternoon light caught in her hair. How peaceful she looked in this simple cottage by the shore. When she turned back to him, there was something different in her expression. Not the old love they had shared, but not rejection either. It was possibility, cautious and fragile, but real. I need time, she said finally. I need to see that. This isn't just a grand gesture that will fade when reality sets in. I need to see who you are when you're not Captain Morrison of the Royal Guard. I understand, James replied, standing to face her. Take all the time you need. I'll wait. I'll prove to you that I can choose love over duty, that I can be the man you fell in love with 20 years ago. As he prepared to leave, Sarah walked him to the door. For a moment, they stood facing each other in Emma's hallway. Two people who had shared a lifetime, but were now essentially strangers trying to find their way back to each other. James, Sarah said as he reached for the door. Handle yes. Thank you. For coming here, for resigning, for choosing us. Even if we can't fix everything, even if we can't go back to what we were, Thank you for finally choosing us." James Morrison left Brighton that evening with something he hadn't felt in years: hope. He had given up his career, his identity, his carefully constructed life. But for the first time since Sarah had packed her suitcase and walked out their door, he felt like he might have a chance to become the man he was supposed to be all along. The train ride back to London was different. This time, instead of dreading the empty house that awaited him, James found himself looking forward to tomorrow, to the possibility of rebuilding his life around love instead of duty, to the chance of proving that sometimes the most honorable thing a man can do is admit he was wrong and fight to make things right. It would take months of patience, of proving himself, of learning how to be a husband instead of just a soldier. But Captain James Morrison had spent 15 years learning how to serve with unwavering dedication. Now he would learn to love with the same commitment, and perhaps discover that the greatest duty a man can have is to the person who chooses to share their life with him.